On the morning of April 14, 2019, in the parking lot of the Midwest Grain Exchange in Abilene, Kansas, a man named Dale Mercer climbed out of a truck that had 214,000 miles on its odometer. The truck was a 1998 Ford F-250, white once, now the color of weathered bone. He had driven 41 miles from his property in Dickinson County to attend a quarterly meeting where local producers gathered to discuss the spring commodity outlook. The price of winter wheat had dropped to $4.12 per bushel the previous week. Dale's farm carried $340,000 in outstanding operating debt. He had 1,100 acres planted. He was 53 years old. Inside the meeting room, a man named Gerald Haas stood at a podium. Haas was the regional director for AgriCore Solutions, a subsidiary of a $14 billion agricultural conglomerate with headquarters in Chicago. He wore a pressed button-down shirt and spoke with the kind of polished certainty that comes not from experience in a field, but from experience in conference rooms about fields. He had spent the previous 12 years structuring contracts between large corporate operations and regional grain elevators. He had never planted anything in his life. When Dale raised his hand and asked whether AgriCore's proposed futures contract model accounted for regional soil variability in Dickinson County, Haas looked at him for a moment the way people look at something slow-moving in traffic. Then he smiled with one side of his mouth and said, in front of 41 other farmers and 3 journalists attending the meeting, "Sir, I think the days of one man with a tractor and a hunch running a sustainable grain operation are behind us. The market has moved on." The room went quiet. Not the quiet of agreement, but the quiet of people who knew better than to say anything. Dale nodded once, folded his notepad, and walked out. He drove home on Route 18 with the windows down, the Kansas spring air coming in flat and dry, smelling of soil and distance. He did not say anything about it to his wife that night. He did not have to. What happened over the next 4 years would prove Gerald Haas wrong in every measurable way. And it would do so not through luck, or sentiment, or the intervention of some dramatic force of nature working in Dale's favor. It would happen through something far less romantic and far more stubborn, the application of knowledge accumulated over 3 decades of working land that most people in the agricultural finance world had already written off. Dale Mercer was born in 1966 in the same county where he farmed. His father, Robert Mercer, had operated 800 acres of mixed grain production through the 1970s and 1980s years of boom and then the devastating farm crisis of the mid-1980s that broke thousands of families across the American heartland. Dale watched his father lose 200 acres of that land in 1986 when interest rates crushed his ability to service the loans he had taken out during the expansion years. Robert Mercer did not lose the farm entirely, but the financial scar ran permanent. He became, in the years that followed, a man who trusted almost nothing with a contract attached to it. Dale inherited that suspicion the way children inherit posture, slowly and without noticing it. He inherited the land too, all 600 remaining acres of it, in 2001 when his father died of a stroke at age 69. By that time Dale had been working alongside him for 15 years, learning the particular character of Dickinson County soil, which ran in a patchwork of silty loam on the bottomlands near the Smoky Hill River and heavier clay-based ground on the upper sections. The two behaved differently in wet years and drought years. The clay held moisture longer but compacted under repeated passes of heavy equipment. The loam drained fast and needed more careful timing on planting. Most modern precision agriculture systems, the kind that AgriCore and its competitors sold through their dealer networks, were calibrated for large-scale uniformity. They worked beautifully on flat, homogeneous fields in western Kansas or the Nebraska Panhandle, where you could run a GPS-guided planter for 3 miles without the soil profile changing in any meaningful way. Dale's land did not cooperate with that model. It changed every quarter mile. You had to know it by feel, by history, by the pattern of how water moved after a hard rain. Over 20 years, Dale had kept written records of every planting decision, every yield per field section, every weather event and its impact on crop establishment. These were not digital records uploaded to a cloud platform. They were 6 3-ring binders stored on a shelf in his office, handwritten in the same black pen he bought in bulk from the office supply store in Salina. His wife, Carol, teased him about this. Their son, Marcus, who was 22 in 2019 and had just finished 2 years at Kansas State studying agricultural business, thought the binders were a charming relic of a passing era. Marcus believed in data platforms, satellite imagery, and variable rate technology. He was not wrong that those things had value. He was wrong, in the way that well-educated young people sometimes are, about what they could replace. The marriage between Dale and Carol had survived 30 years of farming, which is a particular kind of survival. Farming marriages operate under sustained financial pressure in a way that most professional relationships do not. There is no clean boundary between work and home when the work is the land outside your window. When a crop fails, it fails on your kitchen table. When a debt payment comes due, it sits in the chair across from you at dinner. Carol had taught 4th grade in Abilene for 22 years, and her salary, modest, consistent, had been the financial spine of the family during the years when grain prices turned punishing. She did not resent this arrangement, but she did, by 2019, feel the weight of what was approaching. Because what was approaching, before anyone used the word crisis, was a slow convergence of pressures that had been building for nearly a decade. Between 2012 and 2019, the structure of American grain farming had undergone a transformation that the industry press described in celebratory terms: consolidation, efficiency, modernization, but which looked very different from the seat of a 1998 Ford F-250. The large corporate producers had expanded aggressively, buying or leasing land throughout the Great Plains at prices that smaller operators could not compete with. The average size of a commercially viable grain operation had shifted upward. What had once been a reasonably profitable family farm at 800 to 1,200 acres was now, under the new economics of thin margins and high input costs, barely survivable without scale. AgriCorp and companies like it had inserted themselves into the middle of the supply chain with a model built around forward contracts, agreements where farmers committed their crop at a locked price months before harvest, in exchange for input financing, access to preferred elevator rates, and the security of a guaranteed buyer. On paper, this offered protection against market volatility. In practice, it transferred risk from the company to the farmer in ways that were embedded in the fine print. If your yield came in short of your contracted volume due to weather or disease, you were required to source grain from the open market to fulfill the contract, often at prices higher than what you had locked in. The contract protected AgriCorp's supply chain. It did not protect Dale Mercer. Dale had looked at those contracts 3 times over the years and walked away each time. The third time, in 2017, a loan officer at his bank, First Farmers Bank of Abilene, where he had banked for 19 years, told him directly that his operating loan renewal for the coming year would be easier to approve if he had a forward contract in place. The bank, like many rural agricultural lenders, had developed a preference for borrowers with predictable income streams attached to corporate buyers. A handshake farmer selling on the open market was, in the language of risk assessment, a higher exposure client. Dale renewed the loan without the contract. But the interest rate was higher than the previous year. And the credit line was $80,000 smaller. This was the context into which Gerald Haas had spoken his dismissal in April of 2019. Dale had not been in that room asking a philosophical question about the future of family farming. He had been asking a precise, practical question about whether a contract model designed for flat uniform ground would function correctly on his particular land. He was, in the way of people who have spent decades paying close attention to one specific thing, asking about soil variability. Haas heard something else, a complaint from a man who had not yet accepted the modern world. He was wrong about what he was hearing. And he would, over the following 4 years, have considerable opportunity to understand why. The summer of 2019 was dry. Not catastrophically dry, not Dust Bowl dry, but dry in the slow, wearing way that creates problems that don't show up immediately in yield monitors but reveal themselves in root development and plant stress that costs you 2 to 3 bushels per acre across thousands of acres. Dale planted winter wheat that fall on 680 acres of his ground. He made seeding rate and variety decisions based on his binder records, specifically on what had happened in 2002 and 2011, the 2 previous years with similar early moisture profiles in Dickinson County. He planted a heritage variety called Everest on his heavier clay ground in the north sections, and a more modern drought-tolerant variety, WB 4458, on his river bottom loam. He planted the clay sections 10 days later than he normally would have, based on a pattern he had observed across multiple drought cycle years, that later planting in clay ground during moisture-stressed falls produced better established root systems by the time the hardest freezes arrived. His neighbors thought this was odd. His son thought it was unnecessarily complicated. Marcus had run the numbers on a uniform planting approach using a variable rate prescription map from a satellite imagery service, and it suggested Dale was leaving yield on the table by splitting his variety and timing decisions this way. They argued about it at the kitchen table in October of 2019, with Carol refilling coffee cups and staying carefully quiet. Dale said, "The map doesn't know what happened in 2002. Marcus said, "Dad, that was 17 years ago." Dale said, "The dirt doesn't know that." The argument ended there, the way arguments between fathers and sons often end, not in resolution but in the particular exhaustion of having made your position clear to someone who loves you and does not yet agree. Spring of 2020 arrived in the middle of a pandemic that nobody in agricultural futures modeling had included in any risk scenario. The COVID-19 disruption to commodity markets was violent and strange. Demand for food did not disappear, it never does, but the distribution of that demand shifted overnight. Restaurant food service, which represented roughly 40% of food spending in the United States, collapsed. Grocery retail spiked. Export markets lurched as country after country closed ports and scrambled logistics. Wheat, unlike some commodities, held its ground better than most. It is a staple. It is stored. It moves through multiple channels. But the volatility in spring 2020 was significant enough that many farmers who had locked in AgriCore forward contracts at late 2019 prices around $4.50 per bushel found themselves watching the spot market swing between $4.80 and $5.40 between March and June, depending on the week. They had locked in at $4.50. The open market was offering more. They were contractually bound. Dale had no contract. He was selling on the open market. His winter wheat came off in late June 2020 at an average of 47 bushels per acre, compared to a Dickinson County average of 43 bushels that year. The differential was not dramatic. 4 bushels per acre is not a number that sounds like Vindication. But across 680 acres, that was 2,720 additional bushels. At a market price that had settled to $5.15 per bushel by harvest, those additional bushels represented $14,008. And he captured the full $5.15, while his contracted neighbors captured $4.50, a gap of 65 cents per bushel. On his total production of 31,960 bushels, that pricing difference alone represented $20,774 in additional revenue compared to what he would have received under an AgriCore contract. $35,000 in aggregate advantage over contracted neighbors. In a year when operating expenses had barely moved and debt service was fixed. That $35,000 was the difference between a year where Dale reduced his operating loan balance and a year where he did not. He did not say anything about this publicly. He paid down $28,000 of his operating line. The accumulation of pressure continued. 2021 brought input cost inflation that hit every farmer regardless of their contract status. Fertilizer prices began climbing in late 2020 and by spring 2021 had increased by 35 to 80% depending on the product. Anhydrous ammonia, the primary nitrogen source for grain production in Kansas, went from approximately $450 per ton in early 2020 to over $700 per ton by spring 2021. Eventually peaking above $1,400 per ton in early 2022. This was an unprecedented cost shock. Even large corporate operations with AgriCore contracts found their margins evaporating. Dale had made a decision in the fall of 2019 that seemed, at the time, like stubbornness dressed up as philosophy. He had begun transitioning 240 acres of his lighter loam ground toward a reduced input system that combined winter wheat with a legume cover crop rotation. The concept was not new. Farmers had used legume nitrogen fixation for over a century. But in the era of cheap synthetic fertilizer, which had prevailed since the 1960s, it had fallen out of practice because it could not compete economically with just buying anhydrous. The synthetic nitrogen was cheaper and faster. Until it wasn't. When anhydrous hit $700 per ton in 2021, Dale's 240 cover crop acres required substantially less purchased nitrogen than conventional production because his soil organic matter had been building for 2 years, and the prior year's hairy vetch and winter pea cover had fixed an estimated 60 to 90 pounds of nitrogen per acre into the soil. At an application rate of roughly 120 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre on conventional ground, and a cost of 55 cents per pound of nitrogen at $700 per ton anhydrous, his conventional neighbors were spending approximately $66 per acre on nitrogen alone. Dale's cover-cropped acres required a supplemental application of perhaps 50 to 60 pounds, a savings of $33 to $38 per acre. Across 240 acres, that was between $7,920 and $9,120 in reduced fertilizer cost. By 2022, when anhydrous peaked above $1,400 per ton, the nitrogen savings on those 240 acres exceeded $22,000 compared to full conventional production. The farm community around him watched this with a mix of skepticism and reluctant attention. Several of Dale's neighbors had expanded their operations in 2018 and 2019 using Agricorp-backed financing that required them to maintain specific production practices, conventional tillage, approved seed varieties, full synthetic fertility programs as conditions of their contracts. They could not experiment with cover crops or alternative rotations without risking their contract status and, by extension, their preferred loan rates. The contract had purchased their certainty and, in exchange, had taken their flexibility. Dale had none of their security. He also had none of their constraints. The winter of 2021 to 2022 brought a hard conversation that had been building for years. Marcus had come back to the farm after a year working for an agricultural technology startup in Kansas City that had offered him a salary, a title, and the quiet understanding that precision agriculture software was the future. The startup had struggled to raise its Series B, pivoted twice, and laid off a third of its staff in the fall of 2021. Marcus came home in November, thin in the face, quieter than he had been before. He and Dale spent 3 evenings at the kitchen table going through the farm's financials with a level of detail they had never quite managed to share before. It is a particular kind of vulnerability, for a farmer to lay out every number in front of his adult child, the debt, the interest, the years when the operating loan went the wrong direction. Dale had not shielded Marcus from the farm's financial reality, but he had never quite made him sit with all of it at once either. What Marcus saw surprised him. The farm was not prospering. But it was surviving with more structural integrity than he had expected given the input cost environment and the price pressures of the previous 3 years. The operating debt had actually declined slightly, from $340,000 in 2019 to $312,000 in 2021. In a period when many similar-sized operations had increased their debt load significantly to cover input costs, the Mercer farm had moved the needle in the right direction. Slowly. Imperfectly. But in the right direction. Marcus looked at the cover crop records. He looked at the variety selection data from the binders, cross-referenced against the yield records his father had meticulously maintained. He had spent 2 years at a technology company trying to build software that identified yield-limiting variables on farms. He was looking at a man who had been doing that by hand, in a notebook, for 30 years. He did not say he had been wrong. Sons rarely say that directly. He said, "I think I should come back and help you expand the cover crop system." Dale said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I'd appreciate that." Carol, who had been waiting 2 years for that conversation to happen, poured everyone a cup of coffee and stayed quiet for a little while longer, the way people do when something they needed has finally arrived. 2022 was the year the broader agricultural world began to notice what Dale and a small number of similar operators had been doing. The fertilizer crisis that had been building through 2021 became, by spring of 2022, a genuine emergency for conventional grain producers. Operations that had locked in production contracts without hedging their input costs, many of whom had done so at the encouragement of their AgriCorp representatives, who controlled the input supply side as well as the grain purchasing side, found themselves in a financial vice. They had committed to produce grain at a locked price. Their cost of producing that grain had nearly doubled. The margin, which had been thin to begin with, went negative. AgriCorp reported a strong fiscal year in 2022. Their grain purchasing margins expanded because they were buying from contracted producers at locked low prices and selling into a market where wheat had climbed to over $8 per bushel in the weeks following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. The company's contracted farmers did not benefit from that price spike. Agricor did. This is not an accusation of wrongdoing, the contracts were legal and signed. But it illuminated, in terms that were impossible to misread, exactly who the contracts were designed to protect. Dale sold his 2022 wheat harvest on the open market at prices that ranged between $7.20 and $8.40 per bushel, capturing the majority of the Ukraine-driven price spike through a staged marketing approach, selling a third in June at $7.20, a third in August at $7.80, and a third in October at $8.40, when export demand remained elevated. His total wheat revenue in 2022 was $267,000 on approximately 34,000 bushels, the strongest single-year revenue the farm had recorded in his entire ownership tenure. His input costs, while elevated, were substantially cushioned by the expanded cover crop system, which now covered 380 acres and was contributing measurable nitrogen savings across the rotation. Total net farm income in 2022, after all operating expenses and debt service, was $41,000. In the context of 1,100 acres in Dickinson County, Kansas, in a year when many conventional operators reported net losses or break-even results, $41,000 in net income was not wealth. But it was survival with margin. It was the difference between a farm that continued and a farm that did not. He paid off the last $87,000 of his operating debt in the fall of 2022. The farm, for the first time since he had taken it over in 2001, carried no operating debt. Gerald Haas left Agricor Solutions in the spring of 2023. The company had faced a congressional inquiry related to contract structures that had disadvantaged small and mid-sized producers during the 2022 price spike. 3 class action lawsuits had been filed in Illinois and Kansas by groups of contracted farmers. Agricor settled one of those suits for $12 million without admitting wrongdoing. Haas was not personally named in the litigation. He left to join a consulting firm. The departure was announced in a press release that described his tenure as a period of significant market development. Dale did not follow this news closely. He was, by the spring of 2023, in the middle of installing a small on-farm grain storage system, 12 grain bins with a combined capacity of 60,000 bushels, that would allow him to hold his harvest and sell into price windows rather than being forced to move grain immediately at harvest when local elevator prices were typically at their lowest. The bins were financed through a USDA Farm Service Agency loan at 3.75% interest. Marcus had researched the program, prepared the application, and managed the contractor relationship. Dale oversaw the site preparation and handled the utility connections himself. The storage system changed the farm's marketing calculus in a way that was significant but not dramatic, the kind of change that doesn't photograph well but alters the trajectory of a business. In the 2 years that followed, Dale's average wheat price at delivery exceeded the county average by 40 cents to 60 cents per bushel simply by timing his sales to periods of stronger basis and export demand rather than moving grain at the pressure of cash flow. On 30,000 to 35,000 bushels per year, that pricing premium represented $12,000 to $21,000 in additional annual revenue. Marcus had, in the year since returning, begun connecting with a network of younger farmers across Kansas and Nebraska who were navigating similar pressures, mid-sized operations trying to maintain independence from corporate contract systems while managing the real economic reality of thin margins. They communicated through an informal online forum that had grown into something more organized, a grain marketing cooperative of sorts, sharing market intelligence, input cost comparisons, and cover crop data. It was not a formal organization. It had no officers or bylaws. It was 43 farmers in 3 states who trusted each other's information more than they trusted anyone trying to sell them something. Dale participated in this network occasionally, answering specific questions when his experience was directly relevant. He was not, by nature, a man who sought platforms. He was not interested in being held up as an example of anything. But the information he had accumulated over 35 years of paying close attention to one specific piece of ground was, it turned out, genuinely valuable to other people trying to pay close attention to theirs. By 2024, the Mercer farm looked different from the outside and identical from a quarter mile. The same fields, the same tree lines along the north edge, the same farmstead that Robert Mercer had built in stages through the 1960s and 70s. The house needed a new roof, which they put on that June. The equipment was not new. Dale had resisted the pressure to upgrade to larger, more expensive machinery because his cover crop system actually benefited from lighter equipment passes that reduced soil compaction. His planter was a 2008 model he had rebuilt the row units on twice. His combine was a 2011 model with 3,200 hours that he maintained himself with a thoroughness that bordered on affection. But the balance sheet looked different. Operating debt zero. Land owned outright on the original 600 acres. 200 acres of additional ground leased from a neighbor who had retired. On-farm storage capacity sufficient for the entire crop. A cover crop system that had, over 5 years of consistent application, raised the organic matter content of the enrolled acres from 2.1% to 3.4%, a change that had measurably improved water holding capacity, reduced erosion, and lowered purchased fertilizer requirements. Soil tests confirmed what Dale had observed in the field: the ground was getting better. This sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. Agricultural land loses organic matter under conventional tillage systems over time. Rebuilding it requires sustained effort and patience across a span of years that exceeds most planning horizons in corporate agriculture. It is inherently a long game. It produces no quarterly earnings report. It does not optimize for this year's margin. It optimizes for the 15th year's margin, and the 30th, and the farm that your son might someday hand to his children. Marcus had, by 2024, taken over the daily crop planning decisions. He used satellite imagery and soil sampling data, but he organized the data within the framework of his father's binders, cross-referencing the digital information against decades of handwritten observation in a hybrid system that neither of them had formally planned but both of them instinctively trusted. They argued less than they used to. They had found, as fathers and sons sometimes do when they stay long enough in the same work, a shared language that did not require either of them to be fully right or fully wrong. Carol retired from teaching in June of 2024. She started a small kitchen garden that June that became, by August, something considerably more serious. She was growing heirloom tomatoes, dry beans, and a variety of winter squash that she sold at the Salina Farmers Market on Saturday mornings. Her first-year revenue was $4,200. She reinvested all of it in a greenhouse structure that Dale and Marcus built for her over 3 weekends in September. She found, to her own mild surprise, that she was very good at this. What happened in Dickinson County between 2019 and 2024 was not unique. Versions of the same story played out across the American heartland in those years, in the Luss Hills of Iowa, in the Palouse of eastern Washington, in the red clay farmland of Georgia. Mid-sized family operations that had refused, sometimes out of principle and sometimes simply out of the stubbornness that comes from not quite trusting anyone who arrives at your farm with a contract already printed, found themselves navigating the collapse of thin-margin conventional systems with more resilience than the industry models had predicted. They were not, in most cases, wealthy. But they were still there. And the operations that had fully committed to the corporate contract model, in many cases, were not. The USDA census data from 2022 showed that the number of farms between 500 and 1,999 acres, the category that captured most operations like Dale's, had declined by 8% since 2017, continuing a decades-long trend. But the rate of decline had slowed slightly compared to the previous 5-year period. And within that category, a subset of operators, those who had maintained diverse marketing channels, reduced purchased input dependency, and avoided contract structures that transferred risk downward, were surviving at higher rates than the aggregate numbers suggested. None of this would have impressed Gerald Haas, who was by 2024 writing white papers for a consulting firm about supply chain optimization in mid-continental grain production. His papers were competently written and completely divorced from the particular character of clay-heavy ground in Dickinson County, Kansas. They contained no 3-ring binders. They contained many regression analyses. There is a kind of knowledge that lives in spreadsheets and a kind that lives in hands. The best agriculture, the most resilient, the most durable, the most genuinely productive over the long arc of a land's working life, requires both. The mistake that Gerald Haas made, standing at that podium in April of 2019, was not that he believed in modern agricultural systems. Those systems have real value. The mistake was that he believed they had made the other kind of knowledge obsolete. He was standing in front of 41 people, most of whom had spent their lives accumulating that other kind of knowledge. He looked at them and saw a problem to be solved: inefficient operators resistant to optimization. He did not consider the possibility that he was the one missing something. Dale Mercer is 58 years old as of this writing. He still drives the 1998 Ford. It has 247,000 miles on it now. He has considered replacing it twice and decided against it twice, for reasons that have as much to do with principle as practicality. The truck runs. The truck knows the roads. You don't throw away something that still does the job. He will likely hand the farm to Marcus within the next 10 years, not formally, not suddenly, but in the gradual way that rural succession tends to happen, through an accumulation of decision-making authority that shifts incrementally until one day the son is running the operation and the father is consulting rather than directing. The binders will go with it. Marcus has already started digitizing them, scanning the pages, building a database that links the handwritten yield records to GPS-referenced field boundaries and satellite imagery from the past decade. The information in those binders, 35 years of specific observation about 1,100 acres in Dickinson County, Kansas, is, it turns out, a competitive advantage that no data subscription service can replicate because no data subscription service was there. The farm has, over the past 5 years, reduced its total purchased input costs by 28% per acre on the cover-cropped ground while maintaining yields within 4 to 6% of the county average, a trade-off that is economically rational when input prices are elevated and becomes more rational every year as fossil fuel-based fertilizer costs reflect the real cost of the energy required to produce them. The soil organic matter continues to build. The water infiltration on the loam ground has improved to the point where Dale can observe the difference in how the land handles a 2-inch rain now versus how it handled the same rain 5 years ago. The water stays in the soil longer. Less runs off. The plants are less stressed in a dry week. This is not a metaphor. It is agronomy. But it is also, in a way that Dale would not use those words to describe, a kind of faith, the kind that is not really faith at all because it is based on evidence and observation and the documented record of what has actually happened on this ground across this man's working life. It is the opposite of speculation. It is the opposite of the confidence that Gerald Haas performed in front of a room full of people who knew more than he did. It is slow and unglamorous and it does not travel well in a press release or a white paper. It travels in a pickup truck with 247,000 miles on the odometer, down Route 18 in the spring, with the windows down, in air that smells of soil and possibility. There is a version of this story that ends with a reckoning, the corporate man humbled, the farmer vindicated in some public, satisfying way. That is not quite how it happened. There was no ceremony. Dale did not receive an apology. Gerald Haas did not return to Abilene. The world did not reorganize itself to honor what Dale had understood all along. What happened instead is what always happens when quiet people turn out to have been right: very little fanfare and a great deal of continued work. The farm survived. The soil improved. The debt disappeared. The son came home. The wife planted tomatoes. The truck kept running. And in a county where 8 farms in Dale's size category had sold or consolidated between 2019 and 2024, his was still there. Still independent. Still planting its own varieties on its own schedule according to its own 35 years of specific knowledge about specific ground that a man in a pressed shirt from Chicago had never touched and never needed to understand because, in his model of the world, understanding it was not the point. That is the mistake that rich men who have never planted anything tend to make when they look at farmers. They see the truck with 214,000 miles and the handwritten notebooks and the stubborn refusal to sign the contract, and they see someone who hasn't caught up. They do not see someone who has been paying attention longer than they have been watching. They do not see the knowledge that lives in the difference between clay and loam, between planting 10 days early and 10 days late, between the year a cover crop saves you $20,000 and the year a contract costs you that same amount and more. They see a man with a hunch. They do not see what the hunch is made of. Dale Mercer knew what his land needed the way most people never learn to know anything, through sustained, humble, unhurried attention over a span of years long enough to see the patterns that only reveal themselves slowly. He did not resist the modern world. He was not against technology or progress or efficiency. He was against the particular arrogance of people who assume that the knowledge they can sell is the only knowledge that matters. The truth is slower than that. The truth keeps records in 3-ring binders. The truth grows in soil that gets a little better every year. The truth does not attend quarterly meetings to explain itself to people who have already decided what it is. It just keeps working. Season after season. Patient as clay. Stubborn as good ground.